What was the gunpowder plot?
In 1605 a group of 12 men, who believed the English government to be hostile to Roman Catholics, laid plans to blow up the Houses of Parliament with King James I, 1566 to 1625, and government officials in it. Their scheme was discovered, however, and all of the conspirators were put to death. The event is remembered today in two ways: on the night of November 4, which was when the plot was supposed to be carried out, the English hold a festival in which Guy Fawkes (1570 to 1606), the conspirator who originated the gunpowder plot, is burned in effigy. Further, the vaults beneath the Houses of Parliament are searched before each new session.
What were the Dutch colonial holdings?
New Netherlands was the only Dutch colony on the North American mainland. It consisted of lands surrounding the Hudson River, in present-day New York, and, later, the lower Delaware River, in New Jersey and Delaware. Explorers from the Netherlands first settled the area in about 1610. In 1624 the colony of New Netherlands was officially founded by the Dutch West India Company. On behalf of the company, in 1626 Dutch colonial official Peter Minuit, 1580 to 1638, purchased the island of Manhattan from the American Indians for an estimated $24 in trinkets. The colonial capital of New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, was established there. The Dutch held the colony until 1664, when it was conquered by the English under the direction of the Duke of York. James II, 1633 to 1701, the king's brother. The English sought the territory since New Netherlands separated its American holdings. Under British control, the area was divided into two colonies, New Jersey and New York. During the colonial period, the Netherlands also claimed the West Indies islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, called the Netherlands Antilles, which were administered separately from New Netherlands on the North American mainland.
How did the Civil War begin and end?
Unhappy with the outcome of the 1860 presidential election, in which Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, was elected, and fearing a loss of their agrarian way of life, the Southern states began to make good on their promise to secede if Lincoln won the presidency. South Carolina was the first, in December of that year. In January 1861 5 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. When representatives from the 6 states met the next month in Montgomery, Alabama, they established the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis, 1808 to 1889, president. 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, Texas joined the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined in April. Shortly after, the Civil War had already begun. The Civil War, also called the War of Secession and the War between the States, began on April 12, 1861, when Southern troops fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. military post in Charleston, South Carolina. Brutal fighting continued for 4 years. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, 1807–1870, surrendered his ragged Confederate troops to General Ulysses S. Grant, 1822–1885, of the Union at Old Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The war had not only been between the states. It had also been between brothers. The conflict divided the nation. The Civil War took more American lives than any other war in history.
What was the Peace of Westphalia?
In 1644, with Europe torn by the 30 Years' War, 1618–48. A peace conference was convened in Westphalia, Germany. But the negotiations were for long years in the making. The fighting continued until 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia was finally signed. Under this treaty, France and Sweden received some German lands. The agreement also made important allowances for Europe's religions. Not only was Lutheranism given the same due as Catholicism, but Calvinism. The religious movement begun by Frenchman John Calvin, 1509–1564, was given the official nod. In short, the treaty not only ended the religious warfare in Europe, but it provided for some measure of religious tolerance. Since the pact recognized the sovereignty of all the states of the Holy Roman Empire, it effectively dissolved the empire. Therefore, historians view the Peace of Westphalia as the beginning of Europe's modern state system.
Were the Pilgrims explorers?
The Pilgrims were early settlers who sought religious freedom and self-government in the New World. Since theirs was a religious journey, they described themselves as pilgrims. In fact, they were separatists, Protestants who separated from the Anglican Church to set up their own church. In 1609 they fled their home in Intrebari, England, and settled in Holland. Fearing their children would lose contact with their own culture, becoming assimilated into the Dutch culture, the group decided to voyage to America to establish their own community. In 1620 they arrived on the rocky western shore of Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts. Their transatlantic crossing had taken 66 days aboard the Mayflower. 2 babies were born during the passage, bringing the number of settlers to 102, only some 35 of whom were pilgrims, the rest were merchants. On November 21 the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact. an agreement by which the 41 signatories, the men aboard the Mayflower, formed a body politic that was authorized to enact and enforce laws for the community. Religious leader John Carver, 1576 to 1621, was voted governor. Though their colonial charter from the London Company specified they were to settle in Virginia, they decided to establish their colony at Cape Cod, well outside the company's jurisdiction. By December 25 the Pilgrims had chosen the site for their settlement and began building at New Plymouth. The first year was difficult and the Pilgrims faced many hardships. 35 more colonists arrived aboard the Fortune, putting a strain on already limited resources. Sicknesses such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy claimed many lives, including that of Governor Carver. And the merchants in the group challenged the purity of the settlement. Having secured a new patent from the Council of New England in June 1621, the lands of New Plymouth Colony were held in common by both the Pilgrims and the merchants. But this communal system of agriculture proved unsuccessful, and in 1624 William Bradford, 1590 to 1657, who had succeeded Carver as governor, granted each family its own parcel of land. The Wampanoag Indians, who had previously occupied the land settled by the Pilgrims, proved friendly and were helpful advisors in agricultural matters. In 1626 the Pilgrims bought out the merchants' shares and claimed the colony for themselves. Though they were inexperienced at government before arriving in America and had not been formally educated, the Pilgrims successfully governed themselves according to the scriptures. And Plymouth Colony remained independent until 1691, when it became part of Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by the Puritans.
What was the Peasants' War?
Fought in 1524 and 1525, the war was in part a religious one that came during the Reformation. It was the greatest mass uprising in German history. In 1517 the Ger man monk Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, had begun questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. He soon had followers, nobles and peasants alike, and his reform movement spread, giving birth to Protestantism. The Christian beliefs practiced by those who protested against the Catholic Church. While many Protestants were sincere in their faith, some had their own motives for following the movement. German peasants looked to the Reformation to end their oppression at the hands of the noble lords. When the peasants revolted at the end of 1524, they were forcibly suppressed. Some 100,000 peasants died prior to the uprising. They had aimed to get Martin Luther's endorsement, but he declined to give it.
What was the Trail of Tears?
The Trail of Tears was the government-enforced western migration of the American Indians, which began March 25, 1838. As an increasing number of white settlers moved inland from the coastal areas, They laid claim to Indian homelands, conflicts ensued. The government's solution was to relocate the Indians to make room for the pioneers. As many as 17,000 members of the Cherokee Nation were forced from tribal lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and were escorted west by federal troops under the command of General Winfield Scott. 1786 to 1866, along an 800-mile trail that followed the Tennessee-Ohio, Mississippi, and Arkansas rivers to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, north of the Red River. The journey took between 93 and 139 days, and the movement westward was called the Trail of Tears, not only because it was a journey the native people did not wish to make, to a place where they did not wish to go, but because an estimated 4,000 people, mostly infants, children, and the elderly, died en route. The deaths were caused by sickness, including measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Escorted in waves, it was a full year, spring of 1839, before the Cherokee had been relocated. Some 1,000 had refused to leave their tribal lands in the southeast. The forced migration thus resulted in the fragmentation and weakening of the tribe.
Who were the expansionists?
Not long after the colonies won the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, founding the United States of America, a nationalistic, super-patriotic spirit emerged in the hearts of many citizens of the new country. Eager to spread American ideals, many looked westward, northward, and southward to expand the territory of the Union beyond the original 13 states. These people were called expansionists. Not only did they favor the settlement of the frontier, but some advocated seizure of the Southwest. From Spain and later from Mexico, Florida, from Spain, the Louisiana Territory, from France, and the Northwest Territories, and even Canada, from Britain. By the 1840s, the doctrine of manifest destiny, stating that the United States had a God-given right and duty to expand its territory and influence throughout North America, took hold. The fires of expansionism were fanned by population growth during the 1800s. Pioneer settlement of the plains and the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, resulted in an increase in farmland and overall crop production. Yankee ingenuity resulted in inventions such as the cotton gin. 1793, and the McCormick Reaper, 1831, which improved the processing and harvesting of raw materials such as cotton and grain. And a continuous influx of immigrants from Europe supplied labor for the factories that had popped up across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. All these factors combined to create a rapid population growth. In the 2 decades between 1840 and 1860 alone, the population of the United States more than doubled, increasing from just over 17 million to more than 38 million. Though the eastern seaboard cities grew, a system of new canals, steamboats, roads, and railroads opened up the interior to increased settlement. By 1850 almost half the population lived outside the original 13 states. Though Canada, of course, remained in the hands of the British, the spirit of expansionism resulted. In the United States, relatively speedy acquisition of North American territories that had belonged to Spain. Mexico, France, and the British. By 1853 the United States owned all the territory of the present-day contiguous states. And by the end of the century, it owned all the territory of its present-day states including Alaska, purchased from Russia in 1867, and Hawaii, annexed in 1898.
What was the Crimean War?
The Crimean War was fought from 1853 to 1856 between Russian forces and the Allied armies of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, and Sardinia, part of present-day Italy. The Crimean Peninsula, which juts out into the Black Sea and is today part of Ukraine, was the setting for many of the battles. The source of the conflict was Russia's continued expansion into the Black Sea region which, if left unchecked, would have resulted in strategic and commercial advantages for Russia. But Russia was unable to muster the strength it needed to combat the powerful alliance formed by the European countries and the Ottoman Empire. The war was ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, 1856, which required Russia to surrender lands it had taken from the Ottoman Empire, and abolished Russian navy and military presence in the Black Sea region. It was the first conflict that was covered by newspaper reporters at the front.
How were the Puritans different from the Pilgrims?
The Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony were, like the Pilgrims, religious Protestants. Both sects protested the Anglican Church. But while the Pilgrims separated from the Church, the Puritans wished to purify it. Their religious movement began in England during the 1500s. And they were influenced by the teachings of reformer John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. They also had strong feelings about government, maintaining that people can only be governed by contract, such as a constitution, which limits the power of a ruler. When King James I, 1566 to 1625, ascended the throne of England in 1603, he was the first ruler of the house, royal family, of Stuart. The Stuart monarchs, particularly James's successor, King Charles I, 1600 to 1649, tried to enforce absolute adherence to the High Church of Anglicanism, and viewed the Puritan agitators as a threat to the authority of the crown. Persecuted by the throne, groups of Puritans fled England for the New World. One group was granted a corporate charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, 1629. Unlike other such contracts, which provided the framework for establishing colonies in America, this one did not require the stockholders to hold their meetings in England. Stockholders who made the voyage across the Atlantic would become voting citizens in their own settlement. The board of directors would form the legislative assembly, and the company president, Puritan leader John Winthrop, 1588 to 1649, would become the governor. In 1630 they settled in what is today Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, establishing a Puritan commonwealth. By 1643 more than 20,000 Puritans arrived in Massachusetts, in what is called the Great Migration. Puritans also settled in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Virginia during the colonial period.
When did the first Africans arrive in the British colonies of North America?
In 1619 a Dutch ship carrying 20 Africans landed at Jamestown, Virginia. They were put to work as servants, not as slaves. Though they had fewer rights than their white counterparts, they were able to gain their freedom and acquire property, which prompted the development of a small class of free Negroes in colonial Virginia. For example, there is record of an Anthony Johnson arriving in Virginia in 1621 as a servant. He was freed 1 year later, and about 30 years after that he imported 5 servants himself, receiving from Virginia 250 acres of land for so doing.
What was the 7 Years' War?
It was a worldwide conflict that began in 1756 between Prussia and Austria, who fought over control of Germany and over who would be the supreme power in Europe. Great Britain threw its support behind King Frederick II, the Great, 1712 to 1786, of Prussia. But by the following year Austria was supported not only by France, but also by Sweden, most of the German states, and, very importantly, Russia. Spain joined the fighting on the side of Austria also, but it was not until late in the game after 1762. With such alliances forged among the European states, the conflict soon spilled over, manifesting itself in the colonies of North America and India, where the French and British fought each other for control. In order to assert his authority in Europe, Prussia's King Frederick had launched many military initiatives and was in a weakened state by the time his army faced the Austrians in 1756. He was spared certain defeat only by an event in Russia in 1762, upon the death of Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna. 1709 to 1762, who had feared King Frederick, Peter III, 1728 to 1762, ascended the Russian throne. Peter, unlike his predecessor, held Frederick in high esteem, and he proceeded to withdraw Russia's support from Austria and reach a peace agreement with Austria's enemy, Prussia. He died that same year. The 7 Years' War ended the next year. On February 15, 1763, with the signing of a peace agreement in Saxony, Germany. The area that Austria had fought to control remained, for the most part, under Prussian rule, positioning Prussia as a leading European power. There were no other territorial changes in Europe as a result of the war. In North America and India, Britain emerged from the conflicts as the victor and as the colonial power.
What was the London Protocol?
The 1830 decree recognized an independent Greek nation. After the 8-year Greek War for Independence, 1821–29. The London Protocol officially ended Ottoman Turk rule of Greece, which had begun almost 400 years earlier. In 1453 the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and they soon moved westward to bring the Greek peninsula under their control as well. By 1456 most of Greece had been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of years later, in 1770, the Greeks tried to overthrow the Turks and were aided in this effort by Russian Tsar Catherine the Great, 1729–1796. Whose aim it was to replace Muslim rule with Orthodox Christian rule throughout the Near East. But the effort was unsuccessful. And it was 50 years before the Greeks would rise again to assert their independence. On March 25, 1821, the Greeks, led by the Archbishop of Patras, proclaimed a war of independence against the Turks. Soon, Egypt had thrown its military support behind the Turks. But even the combined force could neither defeat the Greeks nor squelch the revolution. In 1827 Britain, France, and Russia, all sympathetic to the Greek cause, came to their aid. In October of that year a combined fleet of the three European powers defeated the Turk and Egyptian fleet in the Battle of Navarino, off the Peloponnese Peninsula. But the deciding moment came when Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1828. And the Ottoman Turks turned their attention to fighting the Russians. The following year, the Egyptians withdrew from Greece. In March 1830 the London Protocol was signed by Britain, France, and Russia, recognizing an independent Greece. Weary from the fighting, the Ottoman Turks accepted the terms of the proclamation later that year.
Why did Andrew Johnson vow he would burn Nashville before surrendering it?
It seems a strange thing for a politician to say about his home state's capital city. Andrew Johnson had served Tennessee in both the U.S. House of Representatives 1843–53 and the U.S. Senate 1857–62. He had also been governor 1853–57. But after the Civil War broke out, the Southern Democrat made a surprising move. He sided with the Union. This show of allegiance was largely owing to Johnson's strongly held belief that the South secession was unconstitutional. Having thus made his stand, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, saw fit to appoint Johnson as the Union's military governor in Tennessee. When rebel forces surrounded Nashville and seemed poised to take it, Johnson proclaimed he would sooner burn the city before surrendering it. But he was forced to do neither. In mid-December 1864 Union forces used the hand-cranked Gatling gun, invented in 1861, to help defeat the Confederate forces.
What caused the Mexican War?
The Two-Year War, 1846–48, was fought over the United States annexation of Texas. The events that led up to the conflict began in 1837 when President Andrew Jackson, 1767–1845, recognized Texas as independent. This was just after Texas had won its war with Mexico. Republic of Texas President Sam Houston, 1793–1863, felt that protection against a Mexican invasion may be necessary, so he eyed annexation to the United States. In the meantime, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794–1876, warned that such an action on the part of the United States would be equivalent to a declaration of war against the Mexican Republic. In June 1844 the U.S. Senate rejected a proposed annexation treaty. But later that year Democratic Party nominee James K. Polk, 1795–1849, an ardent expansionist, was elected president. Because the annexation of Texas had figured prominently in his campaign platform, outgoing President John Tyler, 1790–1862, viewed Polk's victory as a public mandate for annexation, and he recommended that Congress pass a joint resolution to invite Texas into the Union. Congress did so in February, and President Tyler signed the resolution on March 1, 1845. 3 days before leaving office, Mexico responded by breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States. A border dispute made the situation increasingly tenuous. Texas claimed that its southern border was the Rio Grande River, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, situated farther north. In June President Polk ordered Brigadier General Zachary Taylor, 1784–1850, to move his forces into the disputed area. In November the U.S. government received word that Mexico was prepared to talk. Polk dispatched Congressman John Slidell, 1793–1871, to Mexico to discuss 3 other outstanding issues: the purchase of California, for $25 million, the purchase of New Mexico, for $5 million, and the payment of damages to American nationals for losses incurred in Mexican revolutions. This last point was critical to the negotiations, as Polk was prepared to have the United States assume payment of damages to its own citizens in exchange for Mexico's recognition of the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. But upon arrival in Mexico City, Slidell was refused the meeting. President José Joaquim Herrera 1792 to 1854, had bowed to pressure, opposing discussions with the United States. When Polk received news of the scuttled talks, he authorized General Taylor to advance through the disputed territory to the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, Mexico overthrew President Herrera, putting into office the fervent nationalist General Mariano Paredes y Arrillaga, 1797 to 1849, who reaffirmed Mexico's claim to Texas and pledged to defend Mexican territory. While Polk worked through Slidell to get an audience with the Mexican government, the attempts failed. And on May 9 the cabinet met and approved the president's recommendation to ask Congress to declare war. The next day news arrived in Washington that on April 25 the sizable Mexican force had crossed the Rio Grande and surrounded a smaller American reconnaissance party. 11 Americans were killed and the rest were wounded or captured. On May 11 Polk delivered a message to Congress, concluding, "Mexico has shed American blood upon the American soil, war exists, by the act of Mexico herself." By the time the war was officially declared, on May 13, just more than 1 year after Polk had been sworn into office, General Taylor had already fought and won key battles against the Mexicans and had occupied the northern Mexico city of Matamoros.
What was the Great Northern War?
It was a war undertaken at the beginning of the 18th century that challenged Sweden's absolute monarchy and imperialism. During the 17th century, Sweden had become a power in the Baltic region, gradually bringing more and more territory under its control. Even the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, had granted some German lands to Sweden. But much of Sweden's prosperity and expansion during this period had been under the rule of Charles XI, 1655 to 1697. When he was succeeded by his young son, Charles XII. 1682 to 1718, in 1697, the tides were about to turn for Sweden. In 1700 an alliance formed by Denmark, Russia, Poland, and Saxony, part of present-day Germany, attacked Sweden, beginning the Great Northern War. Sweden readily defeated Denmark and the Russians that same year. But Poland and Saxony proved to be more formidable foes, and Charles XII spent almost 7 years fighting and eventually defeating them. But the Russian army was to have another chance at the Swedish, and this time they were successful, defeating Charles XII's forces in 1709 at Poltava, Ukraine. Charles fled the country as the war continued and did not return until 1714. 4 years after that, the monarch was killed as he observed a battle, in what is present-day Norway. Much of the country's lands in the Baltic were surrendered, and Sweden's period of absolute monarchy came to an end.
What was the War of Reform?
It was the period in Mexican history from 1858 to 1861 when the Federalist government collapsed and civil war ensued. In 1858 President Ignacio Comonfort, 1812 to 1863, who had become Mexico's leader when he helped overthrow President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794 to 1876, in 1855, felt political pressure and fled the country. Benito Juárez, 1806 to 1872, who had served as Minister of Justice and Minister of the Interior, assumed the presidency. His position was immediately opposed by Centralists who rallied around rebellious army forces. Under this pressure, the Federalists, led by Juárez, withdrew from Mexico City and set up the capital at Veracruz, on the Gulf Coast. There they had control over customs receipts, which allowed them to purchase arms and finance their government. Eventually they defeated the Centralists and re-entered Mexico City in January 1861. Juárez was elected president later that year, but his authority was challenged again with the arrival of the French, who quickly put Maximilian, 1832 to 1867, in power as Emperor of Mexico. Juárez led the country in a successful campaign against the French, who were expelled in 1867 when Juárez resumed the presidency. He died in office in 1872.
What was the Great Famine?
Typically the term refers to the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845. That year crops failed across Europe, resulting in widespread hunger and disease, claiming 2.5 million lives. The famine was especially severe in Ireland, where many peasants exported their grain and millet and depended on potatoes for their own sustenance. The failure of the potato crop in 1845 was the 20th in Ireland since 1727. And it marked the beginning of the Great Famine, which lasted into 1848 due to more disastrous crop failures each successive year. The crops had failed due to blight, previously unknown to Ireland, which was caused by a microscopic organism, fungus, believed to have been introduced by a ship from North America. British charity and government relief did little to alleviate the suffering. The resulting famine was responsible for a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to death and emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland, and nearly 2 million people left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. Other severe, or great, famines include one in 1769 in Bengal. The disaster claimed the lives of 10 million Asian Indians, one-third of the population. In 1878 up to 20 million Chinese people died as a 2-year drought held Asia in its grips, causing widespread crop failures. it is still considered the worst famine in history.
What was the French and Indian War?
The French and Indian War, 1754–63, was the last major conflict in North America before the Revolutionary War, 1775–83. During colonial times, both Britain and France had steadily expanded their territories into the Ohio River Valley. Since the fur trade prospered in this region, both countries wished to control it. But as the French encroached on their territory, the British colonists sent an ultimatum to them. This message was delivered by none other than George Washington. 1732–1799, who had been sent by the British governor. But the French made it clear that they did not intend to back down. So in 1754 Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, and 150 troops established a British outpost at present-day Pittsburgh, not far from where the French had installed themselves at Fort Duquesne. That spring and summer fighting broke out. Washington met the French, and though he and his troops mustered a strong resistance, there were early losses for the British. But a reinvigorated British force, under the leadership of Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt, 1759–1806, took French forts along the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania and met French troops in battle at Quebec. In 1755 Washington was made colonel and led the Virginia troops in defending the frontier from French and Indian attacks. Though the British finally succeeded in occupying Fort Duquesne in 1758, at which time Washington temporarily retired to his farm in Virginia. Fighting continued until 1763 when the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The British won the spoils, gaining control of all French lands in Canada as well as French territories east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans. The city was ceded to Spain, along with its holdings west of the Mississippi. Spain had become an ally to France late in the war. In 1762, in exchange for Havana, Cuba, Spain turned over Florida to the British. France, which had once controlled a vast region of America, retained only two small islands off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and the two Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe.
What did Manifest Destiny have to do with the expansion of the United States?
The doctrine of manifest destiny emerged in the United States in the early 1800s and by the 1840s had taken firm hold. Adherents believed that Americans had a God-given right and duty to expand their territory and influence throughout North America. Manifest Destiny was a rallying cry for expansionism and prompted rapid U.S. acquisition of territory during the 1800s. The acquisitions began in 1803 with the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France. In 1819 Florida and the southern strip of Alabama and Mississippi, collectively called the Old Southwest, were acquired from Spain in the Adams-Nice Treaty. In 1845 Texas was annexed after white settlers fought for and declared freedom from Mexico, forming the Republic of Texas and petitioning the Union for statehood. In 1846 the western border between Canada and the United States was determined to lie at 49 degrees north latitude, the northern boundary of what is today Washington State, in 1848 by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States secured New Mexico and California after winning the Mexican War. 1846–48, and in 1853 southern Arizona was acquired from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. With the 1853 agreement the United States had completed the acquisition of territory that makes up the contiguous states. The expansionist doctrine of manifest destiny was again invoked as justification for the Spanish-American War. 1898, which was fought over the issue of freeing Cuba from Spain. Spain lost the war, dissolving its empire. Cuba achieved independence, though it was occupied by U.S. troops for 3 years. By the close of the 19th century, manifest destiny had resulted in U.S. acquisition of the outlying territories of Alaska, Hawaiian Islands, Midway Islands, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Wake Island, American Samoa, Panama Canal Zone, and U.S. Virgin Islands.
Was the Civil War fought because of slavery?
For years, American school children learned that the question of slavery was the only cause of the Civil War. 1861–65 with 19 free states and 15 slave states making up the Union, Abraham Lincoln. 1809–1865, had called the country a house divided even before he became president. While slavery was central to the conflict, many believe the bloody 4-year war had other causes as well. By the mid-1800s important differences had developed between the South and the North, and many maintain these differences, or vestiges of them, are still with the country today. The economy in the South was based on agriculture while the North was industrialized. The ideals and lifestyles of each region reflected these economic realities. Southerners believed their agrarian lifestyle was dependent on the labor of slaves. For a long time, slavery was viewed by some as a necessary evil. But by the early 1800s the view that slavery is morally wrong was beginning to take hold. Northern abolitionists had begun a movement to end slavery in the states. But, except for a small anti-slavery faction, these views were not shared in the South. There were other factors that contributed to the declaration of secession and the formation of the Confederacy. Although some still argue these factors were merely smokescreens for the defense of slavery. Disputes between the federal government and the states had limited the power of the states, and this policy was called into question by Southerners. Further, the political party system was in disarray in mid-1850s America. The disorder prompted feelings of distrust for the elected politicians who set national policy. Before the 1860 presidential election, Southern leaders urged that the South secede from the Union if Lincoln, who had publicly taken a stand against slavery, won.
What was the 30 Years' War?
The 30 Years' War, 1618–48, like the 100 Years' War, was actually a series of related conflicts, rather than one long campaign. The conflict in Europe began as a religious one, with hostility between Roman Catholics and Protestants. But it eventually turned political before it was ended with the Peace of Westphalia. The war had four periods: the Bohemian, 1618–24, the Danish, 1625–29, the Swedish, 1630–34, and the Swedish-French, 1635–48. In Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic, the trouble began in the capital of Prague when the Archbishop authorized the destruction of a Protestant church. The act angered Bohemian Protestants and those elsewhere in Europe who believed it was their right granted by the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, to worship as Lutherans. When Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, 1557–1619, failed to intervene on behalf of the Protestants, Prague became the scene of mayhem in May 1618.
What prompted widespread Irish emigration in the mid-1800s?
In 1845 Ireland's potato crop failed. Though crop failures in Europe were widespread at the time, the blight in Ireland was particularly hard-hitting because of the reliance on a single crop, potatoes, as the primary source of sustenance. The Great Famine that resulted lasted until 1848. The effect was a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to deaths and to emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland during the Great Famine. And between 1846 and 1854 alone, 1.75 million left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. 3/4 of those were headed to the United States. In the years after the Great Famine, experts determined that the blight of the late 1840s was caused by a fungus that was probably introduced to Ireland by a ship from North America, where there had been crop failures in the early 1840s. Sad irony that the very conduit that had likely borne the blight from North America to Ireland also carried immigrating Irish back to North American shores.
What are the origins of slavery in America?
The roots of slavery in North America date back to about 1400, when the Europeans arrived in Africa. At first, the result of African contact with Europeans was positive, opening trade routes and expanding markets. Europeans profited from Africa's rich mineral and agricultural resources and for a while abided by local laws governing their trade. Africans benefited from new technologies and products brought by the Europeans. But the relationship between the two cultures soon turned disastrous as the Europeans cast their attention on a decidedly different African resource: the people themselves. As the Portuguese in West and East Africa began trading in human lives and the Dutch in South Africa clashed with the native people who, once displaced by the wars, became servants and slaves. Other Europeans began calculating the profits that could be made in the slave trade. By the end of the 1400s, Europeans had landed in the New World. Soon Europe's established and emerging powers vied for control of territories in the new lands of North and South America and the West Indies. The Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and Swedes all made claims in the Western Hemisphere and began setting up colonies. By the mid-1600s, triangular patterns of trade emerged. The most common route began on Africa's west coast, where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits before traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the route began again. And 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the route began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of the triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the forced migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere.
What does 5440 or fight mean?
The slogan refers to a dispute between the United States and Great Britain over Oregon Country, which in 1818 treaty allowed both nations to occupy. This was the territory that began at 42 degrees north latitude, the southern boundary of present-day Oregon, and extended north to 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, in present-day British Columbia. During the 1830s and early 1840s, American expansionists insisted that U.S. rights to the Oregon Country extended north to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes, which was then the recognized southern boundary of Russian America, roughly present-day Alaska. The 11th President of the United States, James K. Polk, 1795 to 1849, used the slogan in his political campaign of 1844. After he was elected, Polk settled the dispute with Great Britain, in 1846, and the boundary was set at 49 degrees north. The northern boundary of what is today Washington state and the border between the United States and Canada. This agreement reached without the fight threatened in the slogan gave the United States the territory lying between 42 and 49 degrees north latitude and Great Britain the territory between 49 degrees and 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude as well as Vancouver Island. The United States portion is present-day Washington, Oregon, and Idaho as well as parts of Montana and Wyoming.
How did the British come to control much of North America during colonial times?
British and French explorers laid claim to many parts of what is now the United States. During the late 1600s and into the mid-1700s, the two European powers fought a series of 4 wars in their struggle for control of territory in North America. 3 of the wars broke out in Europe before they spread to America, where British and French colonists fought King William's War, 1689–97, Queen Anne's War, 1702–13, and King George's War, 1744–48. King William's War saw no gains for either side. After Queen Anne's War, however, both sides signed the Treaty of Utrecht, in which France ceded Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay Territory to Britain. The struggle between England and France was not settled until a 4th war, the French and Indian War, 1754–63, from which Britain emerged the victor.
Did the American colonies have any allies in their fight against the British?
Yes. France, which was, of course, a longtime rival of Great Britain's, was a key ally to the Americans, supplying them with some 90% of their gunpowder.
What does "Remember the Alamo" mean?
The saying was a rallying cry for Texans in their war for independence from Mexico. The movement for independence had begun in the winter of 1835-36 when the people of Texas decided to cut off relations with Mexico, and soon turned into a war when the Mexican government sent a force of some 4,000 troops, under the command of General Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794-1876, to squelch the rebellion. As the Mexican army approached, the force of about 150 men who were determined to defend the city of San Antonio retreated to the Alamo, a Spanish mission built in the previous century. There they were joined by another 50 men but were still no match for the Mexicans, who kept the Alamo under siege for 13 days from February 23 to March 6, 1836. The Texans, low on ammunition, ceased to return fire. On the morning of March 6, Santa Anna's troops seized the Alamo. The fierce frontiersman, Davy Crockett, 1786-1836, among them, are believed to have fought using the butts of their rifles. All the Texans who fought that day at the Alamo died. Meantime, General Sam Houston, 1793-1863, had assembled his forces, and with the rallying cry "Remember the Alamo," and their fellow Texans who had bravely fought and died there, he set out to face the Mexican army and secure independence. This he did, at San Jacinto, Texas, on April 21, 1836. In a quick and decisive battle that had caught Santa Anna's troops by surprise. The following day the Mexican general was captured and made to sign a treaty giving Texas independence.
What was the goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition?
The expedition, which began in 1804 and took more than 2 years to complete, had 3 purposes. To chart a route that would be part of a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To trace the boundaries of the territory obtained in the Louisiana Purchase, and to lay claim to the Oregon Territory. Thomas Jefferson, 1743-1826, was President of the United States at the time, and he believed that a route could be found between St. Louis and the West Coast. As early as 1801, Jefferson had conceived of the idea that the Missouri and Columbia rivers might be followed west, leading to the Pacific. The journey would also be a reconnaissance mission. Information would be collected about the vast region and communications would be set up with its inhabitants. On April 30, 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. The purchase extended from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to British America, Canada, in the north. Jefferson soon picked his private secretary, Virginia-born Meriwether Lewis, 1774-1809, to lead the westward expedition. Lewis then chose as his co-leader William Clark, 1770-1838, who, as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, had served General Anthony Wayne on the frontier, 1792–96. Beginning in the summer of 1803. Lewis and Clark undertook the necessary preparations for the overland journey. These included studying the classification of plants and animals, learning how to determine geographical position by observing the stars, and recruiting qualified men, mostly hunters and soldiers, for the expedition. On May 14, 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis and headed up the Missouri River to its source. They then crossed the Great Divide and followed the Columbia River to its mouth, in present-day Oregon. At the Pacific Ocean, where they arrived in November 1805, 1.5 years after they had set out. They arrived back in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, having gathered valuable information on natural features of the country, including its flora, fauna, and the Indian tribes who lived there. The expedition had been helped by the addition, in what is now North Dakota, of a Shoshone Indian woman named Sacagawea, c. 1786–1812. Lewis and Clark had hired her husband, French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, as an interpreter during the winter of 1804–05. Lewis and Clark thought that Sacagawea would be able to help them communicate with the Shoshone living in the Rocky Mountains, which she later did. Her brother was their chief. After the expedition, Lewis was made governor of Louisiana Territory, a post he served from 1807 to 1809. Clark resigned from the army in 1807 and became brigadier general of the militia and superintendent of Indian affairs for Louisiana Territory. In 1813 he became governor of the Missouri Territory, the Louisiana Territory less the state of Louisiana, which was organized as a state admitted into the Union in 1812, a post he held until 1821.
Disorder continued in what was the defenestration of Prague.
The event occurred at the beginning of what came to be known as the 30 Years' War. 1618–48, when Bohemian Protestants, angered at the destruction of their church, appealed to Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, 1557–1619, to intervene on their behalf. When the appeal proved unsuccessful, in May 1618, rioting broke out in the Bohemian city of Prague, and 2 of the emperor's officials were thrown out of windows. In other words, they were defenestrated. Bohemia, even as a new emperor ascended to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. King Ferdinand II, 1578–1637, a Habsburg, wielded an enormous amount of power, and in 1620 he squelched the Bohemian Rebellion, which cost the Bohemians their independence. Further, Catholicism was reinstated as the state religion. These events caused other Protestant lands within the Holy Roman Empire to take notice. Soon the kings of Denmark, Sweden, and France entered into their own campaigns fighting King Ferdinand II for control of German lands. but the conflicts weren't strictly about religious freedom. Reducing the authority of the powerful Habsburg family became a primary objective as well.
Why was Bunker Hill important in the American Revolution?
The June 1775 battle on the hills outside Boston proved to be the bloodiest battle of the war. After the fighting in April at Lexington and Concord, more British troops arrived in Boston in late May. The Americans fortified Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. And on June 17, the British were ordered to attack the Americans there. The Patriots, who needed to conserve ammunition, were given the famous direction not to fire until they saw the whites of their enemies' eyes. The Patriots succeeded in driving the British back on their first two charges. But on the third charge, the Patriots fled. The Battle of Bunker Hill resulted in more than 1,000 injured or dead British soldiers and 400 American soldiers killed or wounded.
What was the Battle of Tippecanoe?
The battle near present-day Lafayette, Indiana, took place on November 7, 1811, when U.S. troops under the command of General William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, defeated the Shawnee Indians while their leader, Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813, was away. Before the November battle, the Shawnee Indians had been steadily pushed back from their ancestral lands along the Cumberland River in Kentucky. Once they settled in the Ohio River Valley, they formed a wall of resistance to further pressure. Resistance fighting began in 1763 and did not end until 30 years later. 1793, when the American forces of General Anthony Wayne, 1745 to 1796, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. Tecumseh was 25 years old at the time of this critical defeat of his people. He became determined, despite the counsel of the tribe elders, to halt the westward movement of the Shawnee. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, c. 1768 to 1834, built a settlement on Tippecanoe Creek near the Wabash River, Indiana. Called Prophetstown, it became a rallying point for those Indians who resisted displacement by colonists. Soon the Shawnee who had settled at Prophetstown were joined by bands of Wyandot, Pottawatomie, Miami, and Delaware Indians. The British became aware of Tecumseh's defiance and soon supplied Prophetstown Indians with arms to use against the Americans. In 1810 the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, 1773-1841, requested a meeting with Tecumseh. But both were suspicious of each other and could reach no agreement for peace. Settlers who were aware of Tecumseh's armed resistance movement pressured President James Madison, 1751 to 1836, to take action, which he did, under orders from the president. Harrison set out in the fall of 1811 with a force of 1,000 men. Arriving at Tippecanoe on November 6. He met with the Indians under a flag of truce and then made camp about a mile away from Prophetstown. Tecumseh was visiting the Creek Indians in Alabama at the time, trying to rally their support in the white resistance movement. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, rallied the men at Prophetstown. And at the break of day, they attacked Harrison's camp. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued in an icy drizzle. The Indian alliance retreated, and though Harrison took heavy losses, he had managed to destroy Prophetstown. The battle undermined Tecumseh's initiative and launched the career of Harrison. In 1840, after successful military duty and service in the U.S. Congress, Harrison rode a wave of public support all the way to the White House to become the 9th president. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. John Tyler was his running mate. Eventually the Shawnee were pushed into Kansas. Tecumseh became an ally of the British in the War of 1812, 1812-14, and was killed in the fighting.
What was the Battle of Tippecanoe?
The battle near present-day Lafayette, Indiana, took place on November 7, 1811, when U.S. troops under the command of General William Henry Harrison, 1773-1841, defeated the Shawnee Indians, while their leader, Tecumseh, 1768-1813, was away. Before the November battle, the Shawnee Indians had been steadily pushed back from their ancestral lands along the Cumberland River in Kentucky. Once they settled in the Ohio River Valley, they formed a wall of resistance to further pressure. Resistance fighting began in 1763 and did not end until 30 years later. 1793, when the American forces of General Anthony Wayne, 1745-1796, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers in northwest Ohio. Tecumseh was 25 years old at the time of this critical defeat of his people. He became determined, despite the counsel of the tribe elders, to halt the westward movement of the Shawnee. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, c. 1768-1834, built a settlement on Tippecanoe Creek near the Wabash River, Indiana. Called Prophetstown, it became a rallying point for those Indians who resisted displacement by colonists. Soon the Shawnee who had settled at Prophetstown were joined by bands of Wyandot, Pottawatomie, Miami, and Delaware Indians. The British became aware of Tecumseh's defiance and soon supplied Prophetstown Indians with arms to use against the Americans. In 1810 the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, 1773-1841, requested a meeting with Tecumseh. but both were suspicious of each other and could reach no agreement for peace. Settlers who were aware of Tecumseh's armed resistance movement pressured President James Madison. 1751 to 1836, to take action, which he did, under orders from the President. Harrison set out in the fall of 1811 with a force of 1,000 men. Arriving at Tippecanoe on November 6. He met with the Indians under a flag of truce and then made camp about a mile away from Prophetstown. Tecumseh was visiting the Creek Indians in Alabama at the time, trying to rally their support in the white resistance movement. But his brother, Tenskwatawa, rallied the men at Prophetstown. And at the break of day, they attacked Harrison's camp. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued in an icy drizzle. The Indian alliance retreated, and though Harrison took heavy losses, he had managed to destroy Prophetstown. The battle undermined Tecumseh's initiative and launched the career of Harrison. In 1840, after successful military duty and service in the U.S. Congress, Harrison rode a wave of public support all the way to the White House to become the 9th president. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. John Tyler was his running mate. Eventually the Shawnee were pushed into Kansas. Tecumseh became an ally of the British in the War of 1812, 1812-14, and was killed in the fighting.